It will help me before I plunge in if I know a little bit about who's here. Those of you who are classroom teachers only, by which I mean only means you don't have some administrative job too. Okay. Those of you who are administrators only. Any hybrids where you sort of some of both? Okay. And those of you whose job formally includes doing something about fostering the growth and use of technology in your school. Formally, okay. Any of you who have been selected as victims to attend because you're identified as Luddites who don't know anything about you don't want to raise your hands, all right. Well, you never can tell because, you know, they need people like Alan to cause anxiety because some people need to be made more anxious. So my talk this morning is not about technology per se, though I'll make some references to it. It's not because I don't have any views or opinions or anything else, but it's not what I specialize in. I'm a psychologist, and I spend my life doing two things. One is being the executive director of a small nonprofit community mental health clinic outside Boston, extremely nonprofit. We provide counseling to kids and their parents for whatever the families can afford. It's a noble calling, but a terrible way to try to make ends meet. You may think it's hard to raise money or taxes for your schools. You ought to try mental health. No, in mental health, as in schools, you have alumni, but you can't appeal to them. You know, you can't have your trustees call people up and say, I understand you, from our records that you used to be a basket case, but that you're now marginally competent to walk the streets, and would you consider sending a donation so that we can help others who have sunk to the level where you once groveled? So I know, as you'll hear in a minute, a fair amount, not just about anxiety, but about depression. And the other half of my life I spend working in schools around the country, and I'm mostly interested in the issues facing adults in schools as they work with students and families. I'm not disinterested in the students and families, it's just not where I specialize. Long before I did all that, I taught high school English nearby here in Brookline. And in my life, I've been inside of and worked in one way or another, however briefly, about 1,500 schools. So I know a lot about those aspects of life, and I'm particularly interested in the challenges facing adults in schools as they grapple with change of any kind. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking with other people and listening to educators. And I think there's probably no word in American English, at least, which is more closely connected to change than technology. I mean, the word is actually synonymous with change of one kind or another. And because of that, the effort to implement not just sort of new bells and whistles in classrooms, but to actually change the way people think and the way people approach their work and the way people try to engage students and all of that has to me about it all the classic hallmarks of grappling with change. And what I thought I might do would be share with you some of the experiences and observations I've had and been able to make about change itself and change as it happens in schools, and at the very least try to turn those of you who admitted to Alan that you were anxious, at least perhaps I can succeed in making you more depressed, because you know, it turns out that the people, you know, when you give people tests, the people who see the world in the most realistic terms are most likely to be depressed. And the people who are endlessly optimistic don't see the world in realistic terms. There's a message here, which is that we should all somehow be naively happy or something like that, but some of us can't quite manage it. In a keynote like this, people are usually looking for uplift. Alan and I had a nice phone chat. I don't think he actually asked me if I'd be uplifting, but there wouldn't be any point to starting the Friday of the conference on a sort of a downbeat. But I am a psychologist, and as I said, I work in this kind of difficult milieu. So I found that my own depression, trying to manage the money at my place, lifts if I share it with others around the country. So I'm hopeful that if I could share a little bit of it with you for an hour here this morning, I at least would feel better by the time I get to sign the books with Alan. But it isn't depression, it's a matter of realism. One of the real dilemmas to me if you've been around schools as long as I have, is that so little of the conversation that happens about what schools ought to be doing in any domain, that so little of it seems to me to be conducted in a decent middle place. There's a ton of pie in the sky about how great it would be if you did this or that or the other. There's a ton of school bashing, most of it aimed at public schools, all the things that we're doing wrong and the rest of it. And there's a big gap in here. And there's a tremendous focus, as might seem appropriate, on the needs of kids, of course, but relatively little on the needs of the adults who are supposed to meet the needs of kids. And I actually think it's a real mistake when it comes to trying to implement any kind of significant change in a school or a district to do that. This kind of dilemma is one which I have always described for a long time now as the 400 ways of school improvement. It's a metaphor for me. It comes from back in the early 80s. I had a very good friend who became a superintendent in a wealthy New York district. And he asked me if I would lead a weekend retreat of the school board, the administrators, and the leadership of the teachers union because they'd had a difficult labor history. Gave me a long briefing. I drove down for the weekend event. We start off in the first session. I have to be introduced by the president of the school board, somebody I'd never met, barely had time to shake his hand. He was considerably less flattering than Alan just was. What he said to the people was, I want you to meet Dr. Evans. He'll be our consultant this weekend. I want to tell you how we define a consultant in my company. We think of a consultant as a guy who knows 400 ways to make love and doesn't know any girls. This is not a joke. This is a true story. I could tell you to this day, almost 30 years later, I could tell you this guy's name. I worked in that district 2 years ago. There was one principal left who was still there back when that, and I said, do you remember by any chance how, oh yes, she remembered. Now think what you'd say if you got introduced to a room full of strangers like that, right? Now many of you in the room are women. If I'd been a woman, even a guy this crude wouldn't have tried to reverse the genders because the line doesn't work as well. But there's nothing you can say. You just look stupid. You can't say, yes, I do know some girls. So I wasn't grateful at the time, but I have been long since because it stayed with me as a kind of metaphor because that was right around the time of A Nation at Risk. And since then, we've been trying about the 400 ways of school improvement. And if I had stuff to be on the screen here and used tiny, tiny typefaces, I could fill the screen with the list of all the ideas we've hatched in 30 plus years for improving schools, whether they have to do with instruction or management or special education or governance or whatever, you name it. Some of them have been great, some of them have been awful, lots of them have been costly, and almost every single one of them has increased the complexity of adult life in schools. Even when the outcomes for kids are good, it's increased the complexity of adult life. Okay? If we had here a representative of every single school in America and polled them about the impact of dealing with parent emails, the verdict would be nearly unanimous, and often, if they were frank, unprintable, right? Because it isn't just complexity that's ratcheting up there, but it certainly is that. So, in my experience, you know, we keep trying to gather people at conferences and help people do more and better and sooner and faster, and this is a way we make progress. But if you're not careful, you can OD on good ideas. And what this often ignores, this kind of effort at the 400 ways, is what the actual impact of making change is on a human being and a group of human beings in a particular place called school. That's what I'm interested in. Right? And, you know, I mean, it sounds like I'm just making jokes, but I mean, just imagine while you've been here this week enjoying this event. Suppose across the river, Howard Gardner has been sitting in his office at Harvard thinking up another intelligence. Sometime next month, we all read that the master of multiple intelligences announces number, I don't know, whatever he's up to. Should the students in your schools be denied instruction that would liberate this intelligence? Clearly not. Could this be a growth opportunity for you as professional educators? Of course. Could it cost your schools and districts a pile of money to get everybody trained? Yeah. And when you add this to your instructional repertoires, those of you in the classrooms, what will you subtract to make room for it? The answer is the same thing you subtracted the last time, which is zip. We don't subtract. We add, compress, and we teach it earlier and faster. Right? I'm not sure how many of you know this, but the ancient Greek root of our word school is skola, which in ancient Athens meant leisure. The only people in ancient Athens who could send their kids to a school were people of leisure. Everybody else's kids were working. Just imagine returning to your school at the end of the summer and seeing a new sign on the outside that says, such and such school, a place of leisure. We don't have any leisure left. We're all about this. What I'd like to do this morning is just take a little time out, a little pause, a chance to sort of provoke you a little bit about change itself and technology as an example of that. And there's a lot more info in my books about it, and there'll be a Q&A afterwards for those who want to object or criticize or wonder how could I possibly say that. So here's a short primer. Change of any kind, is almost without exception a focus of ambivalence. Not just between people who seem to want it and people who seem not to want it, but within each person. If, as part of your registration, you had to submit a list of changes that have happened to you, professional and personal, good and bad, and then you took a look at them now, we could look at the list of bad things that happened to you and probably extract from that important lessons that you learned and ways that helped you grow. And we could probably get from the list of good things that happened to you unexpected side effects that were not as pleasant as you thought, or that caused some other kind of challenge that then had to be met. And the ambivalence comes from being human, actually, because on the one hand, we want change, we crave novelty. One of the biggest selling points I'm always convinced about anything having to do with technology is the novelty of stuff. But even setting technology aside, we're often looking for something new. But at the same time, we cling to patterns. Our brains are hardwired to seek patterns. If I wrote up here, projected up here, what looked like a sentence to you, but I left an extra wide space between two words, didn't seem to fit, you would wonder what's missing. And your brain would immediately start experimenting with words that might be missing. You might not all choose the same word, but what you couldn't do is ignore the white space. And we cling to patterns, not just because we're hardwired, but actually because they're what make life meaningful. A life without patterns is a life you cannot make sense of. And one of the challenges of any rapid change is its capacity to make it harder to make sense out of life. And so what happens is we're all, even those of us who don't think we are, ambivalent about it. Now, many of you may see yourselves as change agents in your school, and you're thinking to yourself right now, I love change. And in fact, people often come up to me at the break in a day at a faculty and say, you know, I love change. I like to get there first. Keep it to yourself. The question is not, as you imagine, why isn't everybody else like you? The question is, how did you get to be such a freak? And although you think you're all about change, you're all about your kind of change. If your principal or superintendent or headmaster or somebody said to you, we've decided to de-emphasize all the tech stuff you've been doing, you wouldn't like it, And this leads us to two other things. One, when you hear people raving about change, they're usually talking about somebody else. I have seen the light. You are laboring in darkness. And you need to get your ass over here into the light as fast as you can move it. Right? Second, The pattern seeking, this is really important. The patterns are not about happiness. They're about the patterns. We cling to patterns because they make life meaningful, not because they necessarily make us happy. Indeed, if I invite you to do this, think about the people you live with and love and the ways they routinely shoot themselves in the foot. They get into recurring patterns of unhappy interaction with people in the place where they work. They come home and complain to you about it. You give them advice, and they don't take it. Person says, you know, she's always getting mad at me. Why do you think she does that? You say, well, you know, it sounds like, actually, when I listen, sounds like she usually gets mad at you after you insult her. So maybe if you didn't... And the person says, yeah, but she says such stupid things. Why doesn't she see? We all walk around asking that. Because if those other people were here instead of you and I asked them to make me a little list about you, they could make me the list. We all see it in the others. We cling to the patterns because they make it meaningful. And it's quite possible. Indeed, it's not hard to find, especially in some of our worst schools. It's not hard to find people who have incorporated the defeat of their hopes and who cling to a kind of hopelessness that everything is bad and nothing will get better. And it may not seem logical, but it's psychological. And one of the things that is often most frustrating to people who want to promote change, especially change that's based on a kind of a rational approach to problem solving, is that when you try to help people with what they said they're complaining about, they seem to reject it. This is why, for example, you can find teachers across the country who hate the current schedule of the school and any idea for changing this. I mean, this is easy to do. There's no trouble finding this at all. So, what flows from this is then this. What we react to about any change is not the thing itself, but what it means to us. We don't actually ever react directly to an event. We react to the meaning of the event. If you think back some years ago to the big drama about the little Cuban boy in Florida, Elian Gonzalez. You all remember this? They ended up breaking down the doors to get this. So here's a boy who I think lived with his father in Havana, and he comes to visit relatives in Florida. I think I have this right. And they want to keep him because they're anti-Castro. And so is this a story about rescuing a child from Castro's communist Cuba or kidnapping a boy and keeping him from his closest blood relatives? The fact is little Cuban boy in Florida. The meaning of the event was completely different. Right? So from this, what I take is, I'm not the inventor of this idea, but I am a firm believer in it, and I've had the experience of it over and over, year after year, is that we react to the meaning of the change, not to the thing itself. And the meaning, by that what I mean is the meaning to the person, the target, if you will, not to the inventor or the proposer. So if some of you are coming from schools where you have been frustrated about finding colleagues not willing enough to want to even explore, let alone embrace, some of the kinds of initiatives that you think would really be powerful in improving the school, right? You need to begin, I think, to ask yourself, what's the meaning of this to the people? Not what's it mean to me, what's it mean to them? And when you look at it this way, what you realize is that we almost always propose change full of positive meanings. We say we're talking about progress, growth, renewal, onward and upward, whatever you want. And often that's how it ends up. But it usually starts when you're the target of it, or the victim of it, the person who didn't think of it. What you discover is that just about everybody hates change, especially if they didn't think of it and didn't invent it and don't seek it. And what we find on the other side are three kinds of meanings that are problematic. There are actually more than that, but we only have time for a couple of them. The first one is loss. If you wanted a synonym for change, which is every bit as accurate as growth and development, it would be grief and bereavement. I'm bereaved when someone I love dies, but I'm bereaved when an assumption I take for granted is devalued. A tremendous amount of the school change that's been proposed in the last couple of decades, and a ton of the stuff about technology, actually, even when the language isn't used this way, devalues the assumptions that educators have long brought to their work. Indeed, for many advocates, this is precisely one of the advantages. But when you're on the other end of it, it's a source of real resistance. So I always use a simplistic example. I've done this for years. Let's say, because it used to be true, that I'm a high school English teacher and that this is my instructional repertoire, the lecture. Kids come in, I talk. And like most of the people still doing this, I'm getting more disgruntled because something has gone wrong with the gene pool or the water supply or those middle school teachers. What the hell they're doing down there, I have no idea. But the kids I'm getting are clearly less lecture responsive. They don't pay such good attention. They don't take such good notes. They don't write such good papers. They don't do such well in the tests, and I am getting disgruntled. Let's say that you're my department chair or principal or something like that, and you think that part of the problem, just part of it, is that the kids in my classes spend too much time doing what you're doing right now, sitting and listening, and that I would have much better results and they'd perform much better if they were much more actively engaged in the learning process. We'll just forget technology, because for me what that means is I show them a movie the day before Christmas vacation. But you think if I just got them a little more interactively involved, because I'm the last teacher left in North America who's never heard of, say, cooperative learning or something as old as that. So you call me to your office to give me some gifts. You got 3 gifts. A suggestion about how I can improve my instructional repertoire. You bought me a couple of books about cooperative learning, and you saved enough money in your budget to send me to the annual Cooperative Learning Conference in February in Minneapolis. Well, you're laughing, but that's the birthplace. That's the Johnson's where the horse's mouth, and they got a lot of overhead tunnels now in the winter. It's not so bad there. So I come to your office, but these don't feel like gifts. They feel like a dagger in the heart, because what you're saying to me is you don't value what I do, who I am, what it means to me to be a teacher. What it means to me to be a teacher is I am a repository of the wisdom of the Western world. Empty vessels file into my room, and I fill them with the precious nectar that I have distilled over years of training and experience. Now, you're laughing, but there's a lot of people, I'm exaggerating, there's a lot of people who feel like this. And when they come back, having digested and being a little empty, I refill. That's teaching. Teaching is not coaching. And God knows it's not putting kids in groups and around little tables and wandering around the room while kids who know much less than I do are theoretically helping others who know even less than they do. So I go away pissed off, and you go away shaking your head saying that Evans, he doesn't like change. Maybe, but it may be that I'm bereaved. And the first response to bereavement is never, oh yes, it's always, oh no. That's what we say, oh no. And from this, what follows is that when the bigger and more meaningful the change, right, the likelier it is that people are going to resist, and that resistance is normal and necessary. Normal. Just imagine this. Picture, if you would, we'll assume you're not this person, so you picture, if you would, the single most negative person on your entire faculty and staff. We'll assume it's not you, so you picture someone else. Crabby, cantankerous, mean-spirited, short-sighted, narrow-minded, venal, dumb, whatever. Maybe several people are vying for your attention. Just pick one. Pick one. And just imagine when you get back to school at the end of the summer, you go to this person, you say, you know, it's a shame you didn't come to the BLC conference with me. I mean, it was just great. And you know what? They had a whole series of prophets come to us from the mountaintop. And they brought the tablets. And they gave me the tablets. I got them. Now, not even virtual. I got them right here. In stone, it says, I'm right and you're wrong. And you have to change at once. You imagine the other person says, oh, okay, well, just tell me what to do. You want me to toss out everything I've ever taught in the way I've taught it? Oh, sure. You want, we have more of these kids who are difficult to manage and troublesome. Why don't we just put more of them in my room? Or we have more parents who are anxious and nervous and worried. Neither I just give them my cell phone number. I mean, this would be bizarre because resistance is normal. What's not so obvious is that it would be dangerous because resistance is necessary. Show me a teacher who will willingly discard the way they've been teaching. I'll show you somebody who doesn't care that much about what they're doing. Now, this is important. Not all resistance comes from being committed to something. But people who are committed are also resistors. 20 years ago, I did a lot of work in schools around the country that were involved with the Coalition of Essential Schools, high schools, that were interested in really sort of transformational change in the classroom and in the school. And they had tons of issues about people resisting them. And after they gained a foothold a lot of places, things went the other way, and we started into test and bash. And they've been on the down slope in most places ever since in terms of the money that's spent and where it's spent and so on. And they have since found themselves arguing against change. Now, what of course they would say, naturally, is, well, our change was good and this change is bad. That's sort of my view too, but the behavior that they're engaging in now is pretty much like the behavior they didn't like when they were trying to be the architect of the change. And what you need in a school, it seems to me, is a dynamic that isn't constant change. It's a dynamic between change and continuity. Change and continuity. And as I'll say in a few minutes, continuity is a core value underlying most school life for good reasons. There's a second problem, second meaning of change, which is that it increases confusion. No matter how bad things are in any institution, including a school, people get used to it and they learn workarounds. And then when you make big changes, you upset not only the things that needed upsetting, but the things that didn't. You know? And technology is actually famous for having implementation problems in school where solving problem A creates problem B and C. It's not universal, but it's certainly widely known. Enough that there are lots of schools now where the most resistant faculty actively anticipate that this will happen. But the other key meaning, which I'll emphasize because the time is short, is that change begets conflict. Or that is to say, it would if schools were like other places. When you make change, you create winners and losers instantly. If you want interactive learning, and I'm a lecturer, I am a loser instantly. I can get to the winning side if I go through agony I didn't ask for. And when I get there, I may actually feel a whole lot more competent because I now have a broader array of ways to reach kids. So I may actually see the light and be very grateful in the end. But at the start, I'm a loser. And in most other professions, when people are contemplating big changes, they're more likely to go at it. Should we? Shouldn't we? Is this good? Is it isn't good? Who's it for? Who's it bad for? Who's it good for? Schools are different because in schools, we have different institutions inhabited by different people. I don't know you people, but I know your type. You're employed in a school. You're here in late July when you could be somewhere else, like a beach or whatever. The chances are very high that somewhere in the past you thought, maybe briefly but seriously, about the convent or the monastery. And a life of complete sacrificial devotion to others. But at the last moment, as you contemplated the full list of vows they'd make you take, the chastity was too much to tolerate. A life without sex, or at least without legal sex. So you turned away. Well, you turned away. You settled for the second most sacrificial job you could find. A door says school. You end up with most of the vows of the convent or the monastery. Not the chastity, the poverty, the obedience, the duty, the guilt, and the avoidance of open conflict with other adults. You know, if I had brought my special x-ray machine with me, we could x-ray you out here as you left, we'd find on the center of most of your chest a latent scarlet G for guilt, which I could illuminate easily if I came to school with you right at the start and first day the kids are back and stood outside with you as they file by, and I just picked them out at random. And I said, do you see that kid? Unmet needs. You see that kid? Unfulfilled potential. See that kid? Unhappy family. You'd feel this stirring as your guilt button began to glow. You'd wonder, what can I do? There must be something. The upside? High level of conscientious devotion. Downside? Chance to feel chronically inadequate. But the big thing is the avoidance of conflict. Now, I can tell you, I've been in 1,500 schools. When you do what I do, which is 30, 40 times a year, you walk into a school where you've never been, you don't know anybody, the one thing you can absolutely count on is whatever else they are excellent at, they are outstanding at avoiding open conflict with one another, even when they have passionate convictions. You can count on a nice culture of niceness, what Roland Barthes used to call congeniality. But what you won't see is much collegiality, that is actual direct talk about the work. And I have a signature story about this, which 2 or 3 people in the room have heard many times, but most of you haven't, so I get to tell it again. 20 plus years ago, I got asked to spend a day with the heads of the independent schools in North Carolina and talk about change. And I hadn't spent much time in the South in those days, and I was quite taken with the politeness and the gentility, and you meet a lot of slow talkers and a lot of white men with 3 last names, and to and from the airport, you get driven by white men with 2 first names, Billy Bob and stuff like that. You sort of get the whole, But actually, I've been back several times to work with that group because I enjoyed it so much. Anyway, I'm flying home to Boston in the evening. I'm sitting next to 2 businessmen. Clearly, they're in manufacturing. One runs a plant, the other is his boss. I guess some vice president. I don't know. I don't interrupt to ask because they're doing the evaluation of the manager by the boss. And the candor and the profanity were in stunning contrast to what I had just left with the school heads. Now, I'm trying not to eavesdrop, but about 3 minutes into the conversation, first of all, I know they're not in education because they're doing an evaluation, but the evaluator is holding one thin sheet of paper. That's it, not a whole forest. They have. Anyway, he taps the page, there's not much. He says, you know, this area, I mean, you didn't do shit. You see this? I didn't do that. I went like this. Right? The other guy says, he's not stunned at all. He says, well, you said that if you went last year, you told me to bust my ass over here. Look at that, we're up 20%. I was stunned. Just imagine, all of you had your hands up as administrators. Just imagine your first week back at school, you call somebody in and you say, you know, for years I've been wanting to tell you something. You're not doing shit. We don't talk like that. Right? We don't talk like that. And I'm not telling you for the shock value or the laughter. It was an epiphany for me. I sat transfixed. Because what I learned was this. It's not that they're better. They're not better. They're different. Right? But what I learned was that they were able to talk business without it being too personal. It was like The Godfather. It's not personal, just business. You just got to wipe the Turk out. That's all there is to it. But in school, everything is personal, which is just how we want it. If I had interrupted them and said, excuse me, would you tell me, please, who you want teaching your children? They wouldn't have said, we want tough, profane SOBs like us. They'd say, we want people who nurture, structure, foster, outreach, go the extra mile, extend themselves above and beyond, look for the best in each kid. This is a list of virtues you get in a convent or a monastery. And it's exactly, this is really important, people. This is exactly the list that you need for raising and teaching the young. The point here is it doesn't come with a module that's good at adult conflict. That's the point. It doesn't have that module. Can I just ask a show of hands? Those of you who came into education from something corporate or like business. All right, all of you with your hands up, you know when you got to school here, there's about 40 of you, you had to dial it down a few notches. Right? Because if you talk to the people the way you did at work, they'd be scalded. Right? Right. And I want to repeat, it's not a question of better, it's a question of different. These guys would not last a week in an elementary school. It wouldn't just be that they'd be scorching people, but many things are hard in corporate America, but you can go to the bathroom anytime you want. No, you don't need any bladder control at all to work in corporate America. You got second graders, you need bladder control. The point is not to be like them, but if we had a little bit, what it would make it easier to do would be to say, gee, I think the way we've been doing this is not the best it could be. And we would understand that this didn't mean I hate you and I think you're awful. But in schools, we have almost no capacity. The only schools, and there are very few that I've been in, where they have any real capacity to disagree constructively in the service of improving performance about anything, not just technology, are places that have worked really hard on it, because it's not what comes in the normal package. And while it's easy to make fun of the resistors, it's to me quite understandable that they would be that way. And you know, I remember this sort of years ago. I was in Ohio, and in those days in Ohio, your school had to pick or could pick one of several different models of whole school reform. And the State Department of Education would send consultants out to help you, and they'd give you money and so on. And I was there a couple of times to try to help the people doing the consulting, since that's something I knew a lot about. And I'll never forget these guys who came back from an elementary school to the consultants, and they were just enraged because they had seen in their visit, among these, a 5th grade teacher. And she had used to be in 2nd grade for years, but because of enrollment and money, she'd been kicked up to 5th grade. She was teaching 5th grade. But when she went to 5th grade, she took her Japan unit with her. She had a 2-week extravaganza she used to teach the 2nd graders, in which she would funnel all the subjects through Japan. And they did tea ceremonies and learned how to tie kimonos and whatever. And it was the high point of her year. And they could kick her up to 5th grade, but they weren't taking that unit away from her. So she's teaching some of the 5th graders whom she had in 2nd grade the same unit she taught them when she was in 2nd grade. And they just thought this was awful. And of course it was awful. But from another point of view, it made perfect sense. You might as well cut her heart out. You might as well. Those of you who have chosen, and your colleagues who have also chosen, to stay in the classroom are, in my experience, overwhelmingly people who prefer being in the company of those students. And in all sorts of really, really good schools, you can find lots of teachers who are excellent at their work with kids, but not so good at the work with adults. And if you find, you know, veteran teachers of any kind, really good, really, you say, you know, are you still in the class? Oh, yes, I am. And tell me why. They never say, well, you know, I love to go to meetings with other adults. I love to plan with other adults. What they say is, I like being with the kids. I like to get in the room and shut the door. It sounds weak when you say it from the front of a stage, but actually, would you want your kids taught by somebody who would rather be doing something else with adults? I wouldn't, actually. And, you know, I came across a line in a New Yorker article a while ago by David Brooks in which he said that even though we've spent a generation trying to change this, actually, I'll give you the exact quote. What he said was, we've spent a generation trying to reorganize schools to make them better, but the truth is that people learn from the people they love. Loving the kids isn't enough, but you don't love the kids, I don't care what you're doing with them. They don't feel some kind of connection, right? So to me, the kind of questions that revolve around any sort of change, whether it's technological or anything else, have to do with whether and how they further and enrich the kind of connection that really inspires learning. And when we do all the talk about lifelong learning and all that stuff, you know, part of what we're talking about is, it seems to me, that somebody connected with a kid in a way that made the kid, to turn the kid on, and wanted to sort of have the kid keep having that kind of feeling. So the difficulty about promoting change then, in terms of this meaning of it, is that there's often a lot of negative feeling, and we have very poor ways in most schools of discharging and managing this. I spend a lot of my time now in schools doing programs on this, because if we don't learn in schools to be better able to disagree constructively, it's going to be harder, not easier, to implement changes that get steadily more complex and that risk in different ways devaluing the assumptions that many teachers have built their careers upon. And if we are better able to do some of that direct talk, we have a better chance than it seems to me of really sparking the kind of change we would like to have. But it's a piece of work in its own self. It's not something you just do on the side or just sort of in addition to something else. Now, I could carry on like this at great length, and you would gradually feel yourself perhaps more depressed, thinking, my God, thank goodness I have seen the light, but the others, I don't know what I'm going to do about them. And what do we do? So I thought I would say just a couple of things that may go in this direction. I'm not a believer in being Pollyannish about this. I actually think, let me just say one minute, I actually think schools are harder to change than other places, notably than corporate places, for some good reasons. When I said earlier about continuity is true. You know, you can teach Shakespeare, or you can teach some brand new author in this way or that way, and you can use technology or not. But a lot of what happens in schools, a lot of what kids need to learn, is not fast changing. No school tosses out and retools its curriculum as fast as software companies do their products, for example. Right? That would be bizarre if we did that. The content in some areas does change more rapidly. But there are lots of things about school life on the academic side, and lots on the sort of values and personal development side that are, if not enduring, at least slow changing. And schools are places, it seems to me, that have always needed and always will benefit from creativity, but that do not actually need constant innovation, month by month, year by year. And even when I say a sentence as general as that, we have a problem which would take us all day if we really started talking about it, which is you use words like school or schools, plural, but it covers just an enormous variety and range of schools in this country. Because there are places where we could probably go and you would say, well, there's nothing good here, so anything we try has got to be better. And other places where there's an awful lot that is wonderful, and yet other things that could still be better, and so on. So I actually think that we need some humility to temper the enthusiasm that often comes when we get the bit between our teeth about something that really excites us or that we have found can really work with kids. When I was first teaching, I had experience of this trying to get other teachers to adopt curriculum that I and several others had worked on, and to my amazement, they weren't as enthusiastic about it as I was. If I have time, I may be able to tell you a little story about that later on. But if we want to think about what kinds of things help, I can make a couple of general suggestions. There's more info in the books, and for those who are interested in the Q&A, we can follow up some. But if you want people to change, they have a right, it seems to me, to know three things: why, what, and how. Why can't I keep doing what I've been doing the way I've been doing it? What am I supposed to change to, and how am I supposed to get there? Simple, not easy. Most of the schools I know about, we spend a lot of time on the second two. What? People come back in August and the superintendent announces that we're changing the math text or whatever, and there'll be trainings the first Tuesday of every month, or, you know, at a most simplistic level. But what often is left out in any real way is the why. And this is, to me, the most crucial, because it's the one that bears most directly on the meaning and on the motivation for change. Right? If you want somebody else to do something different, or to think differently about how they work with kids or with each other, I think they have a right to ask you, as indeed you would have a right to ask someone else who wanted that from you, why? And I think it needs an honest answer. There are two problems with the honest answer. The first is that it causes bereavement. This is where the grief comes. Because you say, why? Well, you know, essentially because something isn't as good as it could be. Let's go back to my simplistic example. You're my principal or department chair, but you say to me, so, you know, we want you to do more interactive stuff. I say, why? You say, well, we've learned from Howard Gardner and others that not all kids do well with the lecture. I say, that's easy. Just give me the ones who do. I mean, send the rest to somebody else. Just give me the lecture kids. There have to be some of them left somewhere. No, no, no. You say, we know that all kids do better with a variety of instructional approaches and da-da-da-da-da. Right? I may come to agree and to see the light, but there is no way around the fact that I'm going to have to give up something that I think I know how to do and pick up something that I don't. And again, once I get there, I may feel better, but at the start, I won't. So you've got a bereavement issue right off the bat. One thing that happens with bereavement is it interferes with concentration and memory. So this is why you have to find yourself saying stuff over and over, because you thought you explained it, and you actually may have, but people didn't hear it as fully as you thought they would have heard it. The second is that a lot of folks, and in my experience this has been truer of those pushing technological changes than for some others, a lot of folks feel, well, if I explain it rationally enough, they'll understand. So I'm going to give people 5 reasons why what they're doing isn't any good, or why this is much better, or whatever. And you have to make the case. There's no question about it. But making the case isn't enough. People don't simply give up pieces of themselves. They don't give up their Japan unit just because of an abstract argument, or even one buttressed by research. Because the act of teaching is too personal for too many people. So what you have to realize is you have to make the case, expect it to cause bereavement and grief. Indeed, it's probably necessary to get some change, but that it won't be sufficient. So this leads to 2 other points. A different way of saying why, what, and how is to say people don't usually change without a combination of pressure and support. Pressure I define as anything that makes it harder to keep doing what I've been doing the way I've been doing it. And support is anything that makes it easier to try something new. So pressure goes all the way from saying just, oh, why do you do it that way, to I'll fire you if you keep that up. Support includes financial incentives, encouragement, training, all sorts of things. The evidence is overwhelming about this in all kinds of organizational settings, not just schools. If you only pressure people, they retreat and the resistance goes underground. If you only support them, they just don't budge. And they actually doesn't just mean people who aren't here today. It means all of us. So, in fact, if you are charged with promoting some improvement in the appropriate use of technology in any aspect in your school, then it seems to me you're going to need to think about pressure and support. If you yourself do not have any particular positional leverage over other people, then you're going to need it from the person who does. Technology is like every other innovation in schools. There is no known innovation that survives the indifference of the principal. None. If you've been charged with doing something about this and you have a principal who doesn't care, good luck. You should by all means try, but you're going to be left with your powers of persuasion and seduction and whatnot, and you need somebody who can vouch for you to say, this is where we need to be, or this is why this matters to us, or whatever. And the art here is to balance 2 things. One is, here's an opportunity, a challenge, a need, something we can't ignore. That's what that headmaster wanted you to do, Alan, when he brought you to that school, to make it clear to these people that the way of the world is such that you cannot ignore this anymore. You can't just say, I don't do technology. Right? And at the same time, you have to be able to acknowledge the loss, because you can't order people out of their bereavement. You don't have to wait forever, but you can't order them. And a lot of times people who are advocates of a big change that they really care about are reluctant to pause and acknowledge that this meaning may be different for others, and I may need to allow them a little time, or I have to at least say, yes, I know this is hard, or so on, that kind of stuff. Second, it helps also to be not just clear in this way, but to be focused. One of the dilemmas about implementing any kind of improvement in schools these days, it seems to me, is there are so many of them, the 400 ways. Because whatever your particular schools and districts may be doing about technology, they got a whole bunch of other irons in the fire, I'm guessing, and nowhere near enough money to fund all of them. And we're always doing that in schools. There's a wonderful guy I used to know for years here in a local school who retired from a top-notch suburban district here, Greater Boston, who used to say that in his district you could say, you name it, we started. He said, we've never finished anything, but we've started every idea that everybody ever had. The carcasses are littering my bookshelves right here, he said. Do you know? And you know, if imagine this, suppose we asked you all, said, you know, your registration, please send us your mission statement. Now you must come in a room this size from schools that are palpably different. But I'm willing to bet your mission statements are nearly identical, and they got produced at a great expense of time and energy, but actually it would take really about 5 seconds if you emailed me, because I just sent it right back to you. Excellence, to challenge and change the 21st century. All children can learn, respect their differences, lifelong learning, character, diversity, sound mind, a sound body, the arts, technology, and globalization. Right? The short form is heal the sick and raise the dead. It's a lot easier to remember. Now, what's interesting about this is important. What's interesting about it is there's nothing on the list that's bad. I just made fun of it. I'm making fun of the list, not the items on the list. The list. The list never tells you what's number 1, what's number 8. So part of the reason you need pressure and support and sanction from above is what matters most. Of all the good ideas we need to pursue, which one is at the top right now? And when leaders can provide clarity about that, it makes it an awful lot easier on the rest of the people who are supposed to help the change take place. And if you're not getting that help, you can go back home and say, I went to the conference and they told me I should tell you to help me. No, I'm serious. You can't do it by yourself if you're trying to get change from people who don't answer to you. It's hard enough when you're trying to get it from people who do answer to you. And the last area to think about this is, I think a topic as important, as potentially exciting and enriching as the kinds of things you've been talking about this week, and yet at the same time as challenging given the nature of the work itself and the context that schools are in these days, it seems to me it's just made truer than ever, something I've been talking with people about for a long time, which is that we need to have some kind of balance in the expectations we make for the kind of change you should promote. What I mean is that we need to find a way to do, as change agents in schools, what good teachers do for students, which is to have high expectations, but a real appreciation of the actual honest baseline from which we begin. And in my experience in schools, adults are very good at doing this for kids, but not for themselves. Right? I made jokes about the convent and the monastery, but they weren't just jokes. Right? And so to me, the example comes from the days when I was trying to promote a lot of curricular change in the Brookline public schools, along with some other people. And we found, to our amazement, a bunch of us young Turks, that the 9th grade English course consisted mostly, the curriculum, of the Warrener's grammar text. Any of you know this book? Yeah? Warrener's Grammar? The most boring book in the world. You teach the parts of speech in dull, rote, serial fashion, day after day, to 9th graders at the bottom of the pile, mostly boys who are not going to college and who can barely read, in the apparent hope that when they end up in the Department of Public Works, they would like to discuss grammar with their fellow employees. Standing around the manhole, and you say, was that a predicate nominative? I mean, do you favor the gerund? So we didn't care so much where you ended up, but we thought your English course ought to make you want to read and write and think. Our superintendent gave us money for cut class sizes from 30 to 15. We sat all summer. We wrote 180, count them, lesson plans for the whole year. Start year, we're going to change life for these kids. And nobody wanted to teach our stuff but us. These other people we were trying to get, they didn't want. Turns out, you take gifted curriculum, that's what we thought it was. You put it in the hands of boring teachers, and you end up with a boring result anyway. Because there is no curriculum content that can survive the way it's taught, right? But we didn't know that then. Anyway, So the lesson I learned was this. I have 3 sections in this course. I've been telling this story for 30 years almost. The last one, the third section, met last period every day, 2:15 to 3:05, G block. Computer assigns me 14 boys and 1 girl. And by October, one of these boys is eating me alive. I'm a second-year teacher. And he's a big, burly, loudmouth kid. Let's just say, hypothetically, that his name was Jay Crowley. And we had a ritual in which I have my little 15 desk in an intimate circle. One's waiting for him. He shows up 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late, bangs the door, saunters into the room, slops into his desk, and starts dismantling my class. And he's not mean or nasty, but he's a motor mouth, a comedian. He fidgets, twitches. He's on the go. He can't shut up. He can't keep still. Can't keep his hands off other kids. He can't stop making jokes and puns, horrible puns. Kid is irrepressible. Years later, when I became a sophisticated psychologist, I might have thought of an attention deficit disorder. This was way back before everybody had them. And 1968 is just a pain in the ass. Actually, I think he clearly did have an attention deficit. I knew nothing about it. Nothing I did helped this boy. Things went from bad to worse. I went home some days with a splitting headache, take a nap. 24 years old, I'm napping in the afternoon. By Thanksgiving, I'm scanning the absence list every morning looking for the kid's name. Kind of kid who's often on the list because he just shows up late, but then he's rumors in lunchtime that he's been seen in the building. You know, many of you know this. The kind of kid who, when he's not there, the class is just transformed. You know that kind of kid? Just like that. But not a bad kid. Just anyway, in desperation, I turned to what we would now call a mentor. Back then, he was just an older guy. That's all they used to be, folks, just an older guy. His name was Don Thomas, to this day, one of the smartest teachers I think I've ever met. And he was utterly self-possessed and just, man, I begged him to come and help me. So one day he's teaching the kids, I'm watching, Jay comes in late, sees a new teacher, but I'm still in the room. An elaborate double take to register his surprise for the crowd's appreciation. Saunters over to his seat to sit down. I'm waiting to see what the master's going to do. The master did nothing. He didn't say, hello, I'm Mr. Thomas, why are you late? Take out your book, we're on page 20. Nothing. Jay is briefly disoriented to be ignored, and then he starts into the act. I'm waiting. It felt like an eternity, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes. Finally, as he reaches full flower, Don looks over like he's just now discovered the kid in this little circle, and he says, hey, Bruno, shut up. So help me God. Now, hey, Bruno, shut up. Now, I'm a second-year teacher, and personally, I'm a graduate of a Quaker school. This was high drama to me. It's the only thing he said to this kid. And for most of the class, the kid's under moderate control. We get to the end. Before I can say anything to Don, he says to me 2 things. He said to me, the first, not just unhelpful, I couldn't believe. He said, I took the kid by surprise. That'll never work again. Don't try that. You know, like tomorrow, I'd straighten my tie and come in my second year of authority and say, hey, Bruno, shut up. But the second thing he said was life-changing. And to me, actually, in these last hard years, has loomed even larger. What he said was this: how many minutes a day do you expect this kid to pay attention? I said 50, that's the class. He said, a kid like this time of day, you'd be lucky to get 10 minutes of attention, and luckier still if they were consecutive. Well, think about it. You have an adolescent male who can barely read with an attention deficit, 3 in the afternoon, and no medication. You're the teacher, it's not fair to you. And much more important, you're the student, it's not fair to you. This kid had needs that none of us, and certainly not I, came close to meeting. But things were never as awful again, and the reason was I now had 2 things in my head, 50 minutes and 10. Everything I wanted, which I never got, and an appreciation of what was a reasonable baseline. So when we got to 15, I could see that I was up 5, even though I was way short of where I wanted. And with this boy, as with just about any other kid, you pay a little more attention to what they can do, you get a little more done. One of the great things to me about some of the most creative technological uses I've seen in classrooms is the capacity to help kids do stuff they couldn't otherwise do. And then you get a little more. Things were never great. When he was out for a week, it was a blessing, although I felt guilty, you know, but they were never as awful. And I think the lesson this has left for me is that we need to balance reach and realism. So as you go back and as you think about what not just you yourself may want to do, but what you would want to encourage and foster for other colleagues to do in some way, it seems to me we need to have this kind of notion in mind. Schools change on average much more slowly than other kinds of organizations, except for religious ones and villages. I'm actually not joking about that. Much more slowly than anything corporate, for reasons that actually make sense. And you need to be able to hold this in mind. And the other thing that makes a real difference if you're going to do this, it seems to me, is that when you come down off the high, having been here, because you know what's going to happen to you, a lot of the things you're just experiencing are going to be at risk of suffering plane death. No, I'm serious. By the time you land, and you're back there and you're thinking about what you're going to, and when you're trying to hold on to all of what you've picked up and what you want to help spread and foster and all that kind of stuff. So I think one thing that is helpful is not just to realize that change has these aspects we've talked about, but that life in schools, including promoting change, goes better if now and then you can lighten up. One of the worst ideas, I think, in the history of American education is that we would make massive improvements in our schools by subjecting kids to endless rounds of high-stakes testing. You know, the evidence is very clear that the human brain learns best in conditions of moderate anxiety. Not zero anxiety, where I don't care, right? That's why that headmaster wanted something stirred up. And not intense anxiety, which floods the brain and actually affects memory and concentration, somewhere in here. But the world keeps pushing schools in more high anxiety directions. So I want to urge you to lighten up. So I'm going to tell you two short lighten up stories and then I'm done. So the first is that until recently on the school board in Pasadena, California, was a retired independent school headmaster, Mike Babcock, who for many, many years was at the Polytechnic School in Pasadena, pre-K through 12, about 800 kids. It sits right on the edge of the Caltech campus, founded to serve the children of faculty there, children of Nobel Prize-winning scientists. Mike went there as a student for 12 years, then he taught there, then he was the head for 18 years. The faculty loved him. And when he retired and was asked to run for the school board, the public school board, they loved him too, and although the teachers union and the superintendent didn't get along well, they all loved Mike. And the reason is he's a smart, decent, thoughtful, plain, generous, unglitzy, honest guy who cares very deeply about whether a school is a good place for students and a good place for teachers. You knew Mike, you'd never doubt this. Plus, important to this story, which he tells himself, is that he's very bald. So a year before he retires, he's walking around his campus, and it's a very rectangular, narrow campus. He gets down to the kindergarten end, farthest from his office, and as he's walking by, there's a couple of kindergarten boys out in one of the play yards, and one of them looks up and says the way a 5-year-old will, "I know who you are." "Do you?" says Mike. "Who am I?" The kid says, "You're the headmaster." "That's right," says Mike. The other boy looks up at him and says, "Yeah, and if you had any hair, you could be the hair master." It's logical, no? Headmaster, hair, I mean, you know. You do what I did in high school, it's not the same, but you get your moments. Some years back, I go in for a visit to an urban high school in a dangerous part of a dangerous city, an ancient building, late May, hot and muggy, no air conditioning, bad ventilation. The place is oppressive. The girls have started to disrobe, and they began from a low baseline. When I come in, this girl's been sent out of class for being underdressed. She's wearing two pieces, clearly larger than what I imagine she wears at the beach, but vastly smaller than anything you'd wear at school. I come in, she's striding enraged up and down the front hall, throwing her arms and shouting, surrounded by the principal, an assistant principal, and a security guard. Two of them men, trying to corral her without touching her, which is not, right? She's doing this. And she's shouting, "He said this was revealing." Scorn dripping, revealing. I ask you, is this revealing? And I'm thinking, you're damn right it's revealing. And why weren't they dressed like that when I was in high school? You know? Well, I didn't have to fix it. It wasn't my problem. And I'm sure they could have chuckled down the road too, but not at that moment. So I tell you these not so you'll laugh, but because I think now and then, especially when we get the bit between our teeth about all of what we should be doing, it's important to take a step and to sort of come back to real life with real kids, you know, and to realize that actually there's a tremendous amount about school that fits the ancient distinction between a journey and a destination. There are cultures all around the world who have myths and stories about heroes or ordinary people who have to undertake some kind of dangerous journey to reach a destination. And when they get there, what they discover is that the destination is a way station and life itself is a journey. If schooling isn't a journey, I don't know what is. And when we talk about lifelong learning and all that stuff, what we're interested in is helping kids develop in a way that's going to keep them on that journey, not just when they're in school. And part of what it means is we can't ignore destinations and outcomes and test scores and all that stuff, but we also need to keep our eye on something different, which is the process, what actually transpires between teachers and students. And if you are able to do that when you start back this year, and able to do that with the colleagues, the adults you end up working with, and sort of keep this reach and realism in mind a little, some way, you know, and lighten up now and then, it'll probably do you good. It'll probably help you keep doing good. You're very nice to spend this time with me. I think I'm going to let you take a breather. Thanks so much. Thank you.